Hello, YouTube. I'm Vince White. I'm an employment attorney. On this channel, we answer publicly posted questions from YouTube users getting folks the answer they need from an employment attorney. Got a bit of cough. Got to make a lot of videos. Going on a ski vacation next week. You get the gist. Let's read our question. Also, side note, today someone told me that I was too stupid to be embarrassed. And I really, really enjoyed that. Like, damn! You're not wrong. really, really, really good work. Good work. And also, when I say A-OK, it just means A-OK. It's not some weird racial, political thing or something like that. Well, it's very strange now. All right. We have a question here from YouTube user GB, which I'm going to assume stands for Green Bay. Green Bay's having kind of a rough year. I hope they're okay. All right, YouTube user GB asked us, "Hello, Vince. An employer has a policy permitting 2 days of telework per week. An employee, backed by medical documentation, requests an accommodation of teleworking 2 days per week, but is denied, even though other employees are already provided such. Does the employer's explanation to counter discrimination have to be logical, or can it be arbitrary, such as, we don't feel like it? What happens if the employer can't provide a reasonable, non-discriminatory justification? Would the employee still be obligated to show pretext? Do you see any possible argument any possible argument by the employer to justify the unequal treatment and failure to accommodate? Thank you." Okay, so let's split this up. I think you're doing two things here. You're asking about the burden of proof, which we can answer fairly readily, and then you're asking me to imagine all possible arguments the employer might make. And obviously, we're not going to be able to imagine all possible, but like I can probably rattle off 10 arguments that they might make, fairly quickly. Well, let's deal with the more linear, the more simple and clearly defined issue of the burden of proof first. So, you're asking me, do you have to prove that discrimination went on? On an ADA, American Disability Act claim, there's a couple different things the employer has to do. The employer has to engage in a reasonable accommodation dialogue with you. They have to go back and forth with you. If they fail to do that, they might already have failed their duty under the law, and you may already have a claim. So that's one thing you could prove. If they fail to engage in the reasonable accommodation dialogue with you, that could in fact be a claim already. Now, let's say they engage. We'll go to the next step of the question. Let's assume, for our purposes, they did engage in the reasonable accommodation dialogue, but they didn't give you the answer you wanted. You then need to prove you have the burden of evidence that they unreasonably denied you an accommodation. And we've talked on the channel about what's a reasonable accommodation and an unreasonable accommodation a couple of times, right? Like a really reasonable accommodation is if you work at, you're an x-ray tech, and the heaviest thing you ever lift is an x-ray at work, and you get an accommodation that you should not be required to lift anything more than 50 pounds, and your x-ray stacks never reach more than 45 pounds. Your accommodation is very reasonable, right? Or we'll take it a step further. You're the x-ray tech, you lift x-rays, and you have an accommodation, you never need to lift more than 50 pounds, but sometimes you get big stacks of x-rays that are 100 pounds. That's a lot of x-rays. Well, what you could do is say, I need an accommodation to split the stack into two and make 2 trips. So I need a little extra time. Or I need someone to help me carry the 100 pounds of x-rays. Those would all be extraordinarily reasonable accommodations. Let's talk about unreasonable. Let's say you work at a warehouse and you have the same accommodation. You can't lift anything more than 50 pounds. But the lightest thing in the entirety of that warehouse is 80 pounds. And your job is to move things in the warehouse around the warehouse. And nothing, not a goddamn thing in that warehouse meets with your accommodation. It might not be a reasonable accommodation. Your employer might get away with denying you that accommodation because they're going to be able to say, Listen, the job is to move things that weigh 80 pounds and more. The lightest thing we have in this place is 80 pounds. I need you to lift 80 pounds. If you can't lift 80 pounds, I can't accommodate you. Now, listen, I would argue that perhaps that person who can't lift more than 50 pounds should then have some kind of cart or some kind of device to help them lift, or be accommodated by giving them a desk job. There's a lot of things you can argue at that point, right? My point is, you can see, like, if it's just you got to lift things for the job and you can't lift the things you got to lift, maybe the accommodation might not look reasonable, right? So you do have to prove, one, that either the employer failed to engage in a reasonable accommodation dialogue with you, or that they did not grant you a reasonable accommodation, that they came to the wrong conclusion about what is and is not a reasonable accommodation. Or, I mean, you can just prove that they did nasty things to you because you asked for an accommodation. That's another way to prevail under the ADA. So you do have to prove that you do bear the burden of evidence. Now, they could argue a variety of things, and it could make it more difficult, run interference on you as you make your arguments that they failed their duty, right, under the law. But they don't bear the burden of evidence. They're just capable of putting in evidence to try to keep from being found guilty. But they don't have to prove their innocence on that particular claim. They just have to not be proven guilty. And you're the one who bears the burden of proving them guilty. Now, if the argument they're making is, we don't feel like it, at that point, I would say they probably failed to engage in the reasonable accommodation dialogue. They probably failed to reach the proper conclusions, or at least engage in the process of determining what is and is not reasonable. And they might have been jerks who didn't fulfill their duties under the ADA. So, that's not a great argument for them. And I don't think they would make that argument unless they had very poor counsel. But I think you're asking me, what happens if the employer cannot provide a reasonable, non-discriminatory justification? I mean, they can just say, we didn't think what you're asking was reasonable. It's not the best argument in most situations, but they could say that. It's like, you asked us for something, and we came to the conclusion it wasn't reasonable. You still have to prove your case. You still have the burden of evidence, right? It is your job to prove your case on this particular claim, notably setting aside retaliation claims, which are slightly different in this field, right? There's a lot of claims with different burdens of evidence, but in this field, that's what we're talking about. Now, you ask me as the second part of this question, excuse me, do you see any possible argument the employer could make to justify the unequal treatment and failure to accommodate? Yeah. You do a different job. We let some people work from home 2 days a week, but you do a different job that requires you to be in the office more than them. It's fine for them to only be in the office 3 days a week, but you have a different job, so not fine for you. Or you're training, so not fine for you. Or you sneak off and take half-hour bathroom breaks a lot, so not fine for you. Or like your productivity is the lowest of any person who's ever worked here in the last 70 years. And you're on a performance improvement plan, and we just don't really feel comfortable with you working from home. Now, the counter to that is, maybe my productivity is low because you're not accommodating me, and I need to work from home, right? There's an argument there, but that's like one argument they could make. Like, the average employee fills out 139 TPS reports per day, and you, GB, do 3. And we're just not sure what's going on, and we need you here to figure out what's going on, because we actually don't want to fire you, but we need to know why you only do 3 instead of 139. It's a hell of an argument. Not necessarily a slam dunk argument. There's no sure things. There's responses to that argument. There's things you can fight, but with those numbers, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough, right? I mean, there's a million and one different reasons why one employee might receive an accommodation, but it might not be reasonable for another. Or why some employees might just receive the courtesy. Maybe they're not even asking for an accommodation. They're just like, hey, you employees who have like a whatever track record, or you work in this department, or you have the job duties to work to just work the phones or whatever it is, you can all work telework 2 days a week, but not these employees over here. Like there's a million and one reasons why employees could be different. If you're asking me, is the employer going to have a hard time making that argument if everything about the employees is the exact same? Like if you are the hypothetical employee who wants the accommodation to telework 2 days a week, and all of your similarly situated peers have the exact same productivity, the exact same time with the company, receive the exact same training, do the exact same work, have the exact same access to the internet from home, all these things, right? If everything is across the board the same, and they're only refusing to accommodate you, is it going to be a big uphill battle for them? Sure. Yeah. They could still have an argument. I don't know what that argument might be, but they could certainly make an argument. I'm just saying it's going to be really difficult in that scenario. I'm not saying we don't know enough about your case to say if they're going to have legitimate arguments or not. But that's not really what you asked me. You asked me, hypothetically, are there any possible arguments if some employees get telework and then this employee over here doesn't? Yes. The limitation on the number of arguments that employer could make is the human imagination. Because there's probably a near infinite number of reasons why those employees could be treated differently. Right? Now, some of those reasons why they're being treated differently are, in fact, discrimination. And certainly the employer's not going to make those arguments. That's counter to what they are trying to do. Excuse me. But you see my point, right? Like, we don't know enough here. It certainly seems like there could be arguments. But also seems like, listen, the fact that other people can telework, especially if they're doing the same type of work as you, I think is a good feather in your cap and a strong piece of the foundational evidence of your case that perhaps you should be able to telework as well. And this denial of accommodation may not have been reasonable, and your employer may, in fact, not have engaged in the reasonable accommodation dialogue properly. Sounds like a foundational element of your claim. Just that's not what you asked me. You asked me, like, is there any argument you could possibly make? Yeah. Millions of arguments, right? I just don't know if any of them are true or if any of them really fit the situation. Anyways, GB, I hope this helps. If it didn't, tell me below and I will track the comments and create you follow-up content. But if it did, like, subscribe, comment down below, share my videos. It's how our channel grows. And remember, almost everybody works. Not everybody wins. Be smart out there.